It doesn't start with silence. It starts with the kind of pause that lingers too long after a question, a tone that flattens, a wordless retreat during a conversation. For Freud, no behavior is accidental. Every silence is a symptom. The vanishing voice is the unconscious mind retracting its emotional investment. She stops talking not because she has nothing to say, but because she has said everything she could, and the soul has grown weary of repeating itself to an unhearing ear. Yet, her silence is not a single moment. It is a slow, spreading frost across the landscape of intimacy. It begins in the mornings, when she no longer greets him with warmth, moves into the evenings, when conversations are reduced to logistics. Then the silence spreads inward. She no longer talks to herself in the mirror, no longer rehearses what to say. Freud might call this a form of symbolic death, a withdrawal of libidinal energy from the object of desire. The vanishing voice reflects a vanishing self within the relationship. She becomes ghost-like, operating out of duty or habit, not desire. Her internal dialogue, once filled with hopes and questions, has quieted. Now, she listens more to the quiet than to his words. She notices his tone before his message, the pauses before his responses, the flicker of distraction in his eyes. And in those spaces, she reads the truth. She is alone. In psychoanalytic terms, this marks a rupture in the transference bond. She no longer projects idealized images onto him. Instead, she sees a man whose emotional availability has limits. And in seeing those limits, she stops speaking into the void. Her silence is both a grief and a rebellion, a mourning of what could have been, a refusal to feed what no longer feeds her. But this detachment is not passive. It is active, deliberate. It is the culmination of hundreds of moments where her voice was dismissed, misunderstood, or weaponized. She learned, over time, that speaking would not bring closeness, but confusion. That vulnerability would be met not with care, but with critique. Freud might point to this as a learned emotional economy where silence costs less than speech. This phase is also marked by the internalization of unmet needs. Rather than expressing desire, she disciplines it. Rather than seeking comfort, she learns self-soothing. She journals instead of arguing. She stares at ceilings instead of crying into shoulders. She becomes her own container. The silence, then, is not a void. It is full of unspoken strategies of survival. In relationships marked by emotional unavailability, the silencing of the woman often precedes the actual end. Because for her, words were always a bridge, a reach, a thread of hope. Once the bridge collapses, once hope is exhausted, there is nothing left to say. She is not withholding, she is done. The vanishing voice in Freudian language is the withdrawal of cathexis, a term Freud used to describe the investment of psychic energy. She decathects from the relationship, from the man, from the illusion. And this withdrawal is not reversible by sudden gestures or temporary attentiveness. It is a one-way door. Once walked through, it closes. Still, to the outside, she may appear calm, even kind. She smiles. She nods. She replies when spoken to, but nothing more. No initiative, no warmth, no depth. Freud's iceberg metaphor applies here. What is visible is only a sliver of what lies beneath. Her silence is the tip of an emotional transformation that is vast, silent, and complete. In this chapter of detachment, she begins to dream of other lives. Freud believed that dreams reveal our latent desires, and hers begin to speak in symbols, doors, wings, deserts, spaces where she is alone but whole, free but grounded. Her psyche, no longer orbiting around him, begins to center around herself. By the end of this phase, her voice belongs to her again. She speaks less, but when she does, her words are sharp, clear, and unapologetic. There is no drama, only distance. No fury, only finality. The vanishing voice, once a cry for closeness, becomes the anthem of departure. And if he ever wonders what happened, he must know. She stopped talking because she realized no one was truly listening. The unraveling doesn't come with thunder. It comes like dusk. Quiet, inevitable, unnoticed until it's complete. The subtle descent begins when she stops explaining herself. When she no longer fills silences with reassurances. When the questions she once asked to understand him now remain unspoken. Freud might say she is retreating from the idea's urgency, the need for gratification, and listening instead to a deeper signal, the psychic exhaustion of unmet need. There's a quiet dignity in her retreat. It doesn't scream. It sighs. It doesn't break the glass. It dusts off the shelves, prepares to leave. Her withdrawal is not theatrical, it is methodical. She no longer argues because she no longer believes change is possible. No longer offers feedback because she knows it will be met with defensiveness. This is not defeat, it is transformation. Freud described repression as a cornerstone of psychological life. But what is repressed often returns disguised. In this descent, she represses less and integrates more. The emotional labor she once did outwardly, explaining, fixing, interpreting, now becomes inward work. She begins to ask, what part of me chose this? What wound am I reenacting? The descent is filled with realizations. The pattern repeats. The same dynamic she experienced in childhood or past relationships reappears here. Freud's theory of transference rears its head. She has been reacting not only to this man, but to a constellation of emotional imprints, absent fathers, critical lovers, cold caregivers. In her silence, she traces the lineage of her ache. She sees now how she twisted herself into something digestible, how she rationed her emotions, how she made herself small to avoid abandonment. These insights are not sudden. They arrive like fog, slowly engulfing the landscape. Each one detaches her further. She no longer seeks validation. She seeks clarity. And with clarity comes grief. The grief of seeing things clearly, of realizing he cannot meet her where she is, of understanding that she was never truly met, only mirrored. Freud might call this mourning, the healthy process of letting go of a fantasy, of confronting loss without denial. In the subtle descent, she reclaims her senses. The music she once silenced returns. Colors seem sharper. She laughs quietly at things he wouldn't understand. There's a separation of realities now. Not a rupture, but a drifting. Two ships pulling away from the same shore. He may sense it, the shift, the way she no longer reacts, no longer reaches. He may try harder momentarily, offer gifts, affection, attention, but she sees through it. Freud's idea of resistance comes into play here, efforts to preserve the status quo against internal change. His resistance meets her transformation, and the latter wins. She is no longer interested in salvaging what does not nourish. She does not wish him harm. She simply wishes herself peace. The descent is not into darkness, but into self, into solitude, into quiet knowing. Is not the beginning of the end, is the end itself. She speaks less, feels more, smiles less, sees more. He wonders why she is distant. She wonders why she stayed so long. There is no announcement, no confrontation, just the slow erosion of intimacy until the landscape is unfamiliar, until the echo returns louder than his voice. In psychoanalysis, Freud believed that insight precedes change. The subtle descent is the gathering of insight. Not dramatic, but definitive. Her silence is not absence, it is presence. Of mind, of boundary, of self. And so she descends, not into despair, but into depth. Into a life where she no longer needs to explain the silence. Because finally she understands it. The economics of attention. Love, in Freud's view, is not just an emotion, it is an energetic investment. Psychic energy, or libido, flows toward what we desire, what we hope will return nourishment. When a woman detaches, that energy, the currency of care, begins to be withdrawn. Attention narrows. Once expansive and generous, her gaze now becomes economical. She gives only what's essential, nothing more. The early signs are deceptively small. She no longer remembers the details he shared, no longer initiates conversations. Her curiosity fades, not from cruelty, but from depletion. Attention, Freud would argue, is never neutral. It either invests or it withdraws. She is withdrawing not out of coldness, but as a survival instinct. To continue investing would be to bankrupt herself. In Freud's framework, this shift in attention can be read as a change in cathexis, the process by which psychic energy is bound to a person or object. She is decathecting, reassigning her energy. What was once spent on decoding his moods, on crafting text with care, on scanning his silences for meaning, now that same energy is turning inward. Not narcissism, but reclamation. He may feel this as distance, as moodiness, as a lack of warmth. But it is not mood, it is mourning. She is grieving the loss of a connection she once tried to nourish. The grief is not always loud. Often it is logistical. She doesn't reach out, doesn't ask how his day went, doesn't plan their weekends. Freud would say this is the unconscious mind conserving itself, preparing to let go. In earlier phases of attachment, Her attention may have been relentless. Watching him sleep, reading between his texts, wondering what he meant, what he felt, what he needed. But now, that same woman feels a strange quiet inside. Not confusion, not rage, just stillness. She no longer obsesses. She notices. And then she lets go. Attention, in the Freudian sense, is a form of desire. It reveals where we hope to be met. When she stops paying attention, it is not because she doesn't care, it is because she no longer believes she will be cared for in return. Desire has been replaced by a quiet calculation. Is this still worth it? She begins to see how much she gave without reciprocity. How much of her day was shaped by his rhythms. How often she sacrificed her peace to preserve his. Freud called this repetition compulsion, the tendency to recreate unresolved emotional wounds in hopes of healing them. Her overinvestment was not just about love. It was about the past playing out again. But something inside her shifts. The emotional accounting begins. She tallies the hours she waited for a response. The nights she soothed herself alone. The days she excused behavior that bruised her spirit. Freud might suggest this is the ego reclaiming control, asserting, finally, that the cost is too high. Attention is finite, and she is learning to spend it on herself. Where she once monitored his emotional weather, now she tunes into her own. She starts new rituals, lighting a candle at night, reading in silence, making dinner just for herself. These acts are small but sacred. They mark the redirection of energy. He may accuse her of being cold, distant, selfish. But Freud would interpret this as a projection. His inability to face her detachment becomes an accusation. In truth, she is not absent. She is present with herself. What he experiences as loss is her return to sovereignty. As she withdraws her attention, he may attempt to pull her back. Through charm, guilt, sudden displays of affection. But she sees these for what they are, attempts to resecure the flow of her energy. Not because he loves deeply, but because he misses the fuel. Freud warned us that narcissistic injury often leads to manipulation masked as love. The real shift occurs when she no longer reacts. Not because she's numb, but because she's awake. Awake to the dynamics that drained her. Awake to the reality that love should not cost her selfhood. Freud would call this sublimation, the transformation of psychic energy from destructive to constructive forms. She stops pouring herself into a cracked cup and begins building a container of her own. She is not cruel. She simply no longer performs emotional labor unpaid. No longer gives freely what was never valued. Her attention, once given reflexively, now comes with intention. And that intention is this, to care without self-erasure. In the end, it's not just that she stops talking. She stops listening. She stops waiting. She stops hoping. And in that silence, she hears something sacred. Her own name, called back to her from the depths. Her attention, once scattered across another's needs, now rests inside her own. Freud might say she has begun the true work of mourning, of letting go, of coming home to herself. There is a haunting rhythm to her past choices. Different names, same endings, different faces, same absences. Freud called it repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to recreate and relive early wounds, as if this time, love might heal what origin fractured. She does not know she's reenacting a script. She only knows that every relationship eventually feels the same. Familiar ache. Familiar silence. She stayed too long because she believed love meant endurance. That staying meant loyalty. That if she tried harder, explained more, softened further, she might finally be loved in the way she loved. But over time, the realization dawns, she was loving a shadow. Not a person, but a projection. The mind returns to what it couldn't resolve. If her father was distant, her partner becomes emotionally unavailable. If her mother was critical, he becomes subtly invalidating. The soul seeks repetition, not for comfort, but for mastery. Freud believed we return to pain not because we enjoy it, but because we hope to overcome it. But love, she is learning, is not a battlefield, is not therapy, is not a home for the unresolved. This cycle is unconscious, and it's potent. He is not abusive, not openly cruel, just absent in the right way. Just cold enough, just distant enough to reawaken the early ache. And in her trying to be enough for him, she's really trying to be enough for the parent who once withheld love. But something cracks. Perhaps it is exhaustion. Perhaps a friend names the pattern. Perhaps she reads something that mirrors her experience too closely. Whatever it is, the veil lifts. And she sees, not him, but the loop. the closed circuit of her own need reenacting itself again and again. She realizes she's been fighting for more than a relationship. She's been fighting for a rewrite of history. This insight is brutal. It destabilizes her sense of agency. She wonders, was it ever love? Or just repetition? The sorrow is deep. The anger deeper. Because now she must confront the reality that he didn't hurt her uniquely. He simply stepped into a role already written. A role she cast him in. And he accepted, consciously or not. But this is also where power returns. Freud would say insight is the beginning of liberation. Once the unconscious becomes conscious, the pattern can be broken. She begins to trace the lineage of her desire. She sees how often she pursued emotionally unavailable men. How often she mistook silence for depth, withholding for mystery, pain for passion. The spell breaks when she finally names it. This is not love. This is familiarity. This is trauma dressed as attraction. And when she sees that clearly, her body begins to reject what it once craved. The same gestures that once thrilled her now repulse her. The same chase that once excited her now exhausts her. She feels herself shifting, not because he changed, but because her awareness did. And so she stops chasing, stops explaining, stops fighting for closeness with someone who only mirrors her wounds. Her silence now is sacred, is not the silence of suppression, it is the silence of recognition, of pattern interrupted, of spell broken. Freud wrote that healing requires mourning, the loss not only of the person, but of the illusion. And so she mourns, not just this man, but all the men she thought could fill the gap left by another. She grieves the time lost, the energy spent, the self betrayed, but she also celebrates. Quietly, she celebrates the moment she chose herself, the moment she walked away without slamming the door, the moment she decided not to fix, not to chase, not to explain, the moment she finally understood that repetition is not fate. It is an invitation to break the cycle. And she does. Not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. She exits the loop. And with every step into solitude, she reclaims the self she once abandoned in pursuit of someone else's approval. Freud might say she has begun the true work of individuation, not becoming who he wants or what her past demanded, but who she was always meant to be. And so the silence grows, not as punishment, but as freedom. The repetition ends here. There is a moment, quiet, internal, when a woman stops confusing him with someone else, when she stops speaking to the ghost behind his face. Freud called it transference, the redirection of feelings from one person onto another, often unconsciously. In love, transference is common. We see our father's distance in his distracted gaze. We feel our mother's coldness in his silence. We don't just fall for people, we fall for familiar emotional terrain. At first it feels like magic, a connection so strong it must mean something divine. But eventually it unravels. She realizes that the intensity wasn't chemistry, it was memory. Unhealed, unspoken, unresolved memory. And she was not relating to him as he is, but as he reminded her of who came before. Freud insisted that transference is not a flaw, is the psyche trying to finish an old story. But some stories were never ours to finish. When she detaches, it's because she recognizes this. She sees the pattern for what it is, a haunting. She begins to withdraw not just from him, but from the illusion. From the way she made him her unfinished sentence, her apology, her hope, her prayer. This withdrawal is not cold, it is sacred. She begins to strip away the projections, to see the man for who he actually is. And often, what she sees breaks her heart. Not because he's terrible, but because he's human. Flawed, incomplete, incapable of carrying the weight of her healing. She stops waiting for him to be what he never claimed to be. Stops pleading for him to become what he never promised. Freud believed that true maturity comes when we take back our projections, when we reclaim the pieces of ourselves we've scattered onto others. And she is gathering those pieces now. It is a quiet revolution. She no longer blames him for not reading her mind. She no longer rages when he doesn't react the way she hoped. Instead, she watches, observes, withdraws. And as she withdraws, she reclaims the power she once gave away. The power to name her own needs, to meet her own gaze, to know where she ends and another begins. She stops asking him to be the mirror. She becomes her own. This detachment doesn't make her bitter. It makes her clear. She may still care, still wish things had turned out differently, but she no longer negotiates with her own clarity to stay close to someone who cannot meet her there. Freud wrote that healing often requires the painful work of disillusionment, seeing things as they are, not as we wish they were. And she is doing that work now. Unflinching, unapologetic. In the space where her voice once reached toward him, there is now silence. Not because she has nothing left to say, but because what remains no longer requires his witness. Her healing is no longer contingent on his response. Her story is no longer waiting for his chapter. And so she steps back, withdraws her energy, her hope, her need, not out of punishment, but out of peace, out of the sacred knowing that she is whole, even when unseen, that she is healing, even when unheard. Freud might say she has reclaimed the authorship of her inner world. And when he looks around and realizes she is no longer trying, he may call it silence, but she will know, is freedom. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps these emotional journeys reach more women navigating their own paths of healing and clarity. Have you felt this too? Share your story below. Your words may help someone today.